So, hello everyone, and moving on to our next speaker for the evening. So, we have Dr. Raut sir, Dr. Abhishek Raut sir, who would be talking about quantitative study designs and data collection techniques. Abhishek P. Raut sir is a physician, teacher, and researcher. At present, he is working as a professor in the Department of Community Medicine at MGIMS, a diplomat of board diplomat of National Board in Social and Preventive Medicine. He completed his MBBS and MD from said GS Medical College and KM Hospital, Mumbai. He is a member of the Indian Association of Preventive and Social Medicine and Indian Public Health. He is also a field inspector and trained specialist in high altitude mountain medicine. So, sir, the floor is yours. We'll start with the presentation.
Hello.
I think there's some issue with the.
Just let my other moderators to just mute themselves so that there isn't any further noise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So should we go ahead with your permission?
Good evening, everyone. We are almost at the fag end of the day, and I understand that it's a very laborious task. You're sitting in front of your computers, laptops, or with your mobile since 2 in the afternoon, almost 2 in the afternoon, and it's already more than 4 hours. I had posted a small poll to ask how many of you have had a prior tryst with research, and there's nothing much to differentiate. Almost same proportion of you are saying that yes and no. I'll ask another question for especially for those who have participated in any form of research. Which study design did you use? I'm just typing, give me a minute. It was not allowing me to create two polls simultaneously. Feel free to stop or interrupt me at any point of time in between. If you feel that any point needs more clarification, we won't be able to go in the details of in intricate details of all the study designs, but I'll try and give you an overview that should help you to choose appropriate study design for your study. I've just put a poll regarding or with respect to the 4 commonly used study designs. If anybody has used anything else apart from this, you can put it in your chat. I hope my voice is clear. Yeah. So I'll just wait for a minute to see what responses I get for the poll that I've just created. So around a little over 50% of you are saying you have conducted a cross-sectional study. Around 1/4 of you are saying a case control study. Around 15% are saying some randomized trial, and around 5% are saying a cohort study. Believe me, not at all bad. Okay, the first study that I was able to conduct or was a part of was when I did my MD dissertation. So prior to that, I never had any tryst with research, and I am not doing that badly currently in the field of research. I have been able to acquire few grants on my own. I have I did write all those grants totally by my own, and they have been sanctioned. I so that's what I meant when I said I'm not doing very badly in the field of research. So my message is simple. it's ABCD. Anybody can do it, provided you have the willingness for it. So don't be overawed, or don't be subdued by whatever you may have heard from the previous speakers. Of course, you will need commitment, you will need hard work, but ऐसा नहीं है कि सिर्फ आप कहीं रिमोट किसी एरिया में जाके रहेंगे तो ही रिसर्च हो सकता है. Okay, you will be able to do meaningful research and contribute from any place where you are working, provided you have the will and passion for that. Okay, so if today and tomorrow, whatever sessions that you are going to be a part of, if these sessions are able to kindle that passion in you, somewhere I think the organizers would feel that the purpose is served. Next slide. I can change the this myself. Yeah. Okay. So I think Dr. Hemant has discussed this with you. So I'll not go into what all goes in a protocol or in a research. We call it as the anatomy of research, but this is the section on which I would be focusing on, the study designs part. Okay, and when we say the study designs part, it becomes more often than not, it becomes the heart of your protocol, because that is where, or it is from this knowledge you will be able to write the chunk of your methods section. What you do with this section will decide how good or valid your study would be. So you cannot neglect this part. Okay. Whenever we undertake any research, so basically we have two broad goals related to that. One is to study the patterns of disease occurrence. Okay, so how frequent is the disease, or what is the magnitude of the disease, and what are the causes or risk factors or predictors for that particular disease. Okay, and whenever we are bothered about research, invariably you will have to familiarize yourselves with these three terms: exposure, outcome, and confounders. Okay, so if anybody wants to ask regarding what exactly these terms mean, you can raise your hands and I can explain. If not, we can proceed further. Okay. So if you are trying to study the association of smoking with coronary artery disease, smoking here becomes the exposure, coronary artery disease becomes the outcome. Okay, and confounders could be any of the other variables, for example being a male, for example being alcoholic, okay, which can introduce error in your results. Okay, so I'm deliberately spending some time on these three terms because these are the three terms which will come again and again to haunt you. When we discuss about data collection, that time also we will need to bother about these three terms, or these three types of variables: the exposure variables, the outcome variables, and the confounding variables. So whatever error, okay, if you choose your population wrongly, you will not be able to extrapolate that result to the general population, to the overall population. Okay, and that will compromise the external validity of your result. If you do not measure something in the way in which you are supposed to measure it, let us say for example you are using a faulty blood pressure machine, or you are using a faulty weighing scale, okay, so it will skew the results of your entire study, and which in turn will compromise the internal validity of your study. So whatever takes you away from the truth in the universe, so like I said in my previous slide, the basic goal of the research is to identify this truth, okay, the true finding, and whatever is going to take you away from this true finding will be your error. It could be a naturally occurring error. For example, if I measure your blood pressure just before you are going to enter for any interview or for any viva, it would be naturally raised, so it's a physiological variation. Okay, so such errors because of physiological variation would get classified as random errors. And the simplest way to address those is to increase your sample size, to take a large sample size. Okay? If you choose your respondents inappropriately, if you do not choose your respondents using a systematic method, if they volunteer, if you choose them by convenience, which usually happens, all those who come to the OPD of our hospital, all those who were admitted in XYZ ward of our hospital. So if you are choosing them merely by convenience, or if you are allowing them to volunteer, that will also lead to selection error or selection bias, as we call it, and it will also compromise on internal validity. So it's very important, whenever we are thinking of study design, we'll have to choose a design which will help us to reduce these errors, either the random error or the systematic error. So whatever you conduct as a researcher, which is not a natural error, if you are erring in selecting somebody, selection error or selection bias. If you are erring in measuring something, the measurement bias, the selection bias, they are examples of systematic errors. They are not going to happen unless you conduct them as researchers. So it's very important that you are very meticulous about not conducting these systematic errors. And plus, if you ensure that you take an adequate sample, you will also ensure that your random error is minimized. Any questions on this slide? If no, we can move ahead. How do I come to know if there are any questions or no?
So the questions would be.
Will they type yes, no, or do I need to take
Sir,
a note?
we'll be keeping the question and answers. So we are receiving it in the Q&A section, and Garima will be moderating after your session.
So there is a change.
So which
Prabhat
study
will be
design is
moderating for the same.
best? If you want to reduce your error, or which is the study most suited to help you capture that truth in the universe? Because if you remember the previous slide, we said that the intention of research is to capture that truth in the universe. So which is that study design which will help you to capture that truth in the universe? Okay, the causal effect, that A causes B. If you want to capture this, which is the best study design? Okay, so the best study design would be which will not have error because of confounding, which will not have measurement bias, which will not have selection bias, which will not have any inference or reporting bias, or which will not have any bias because of information use. So the best design would be, what we say is, which will have minimum of errors in it. A study design with minimal errors. So we'll see as we proceed further which are the study designs which will have these minimal errors. So for time being, even if you are able to remember which are the errors that we need to bother about, the purpose would be served. So we need to bother about the random errors, the measurement bias, the selection bias, and confounding at least. Okay, so these are the 4 things that we need to bother about whenever we are going to choose any study design. Even if you are not able to remember anything from what I am discussing, but if you are able to remember this chart, the purpose would be served. Okay. For every chart, the source or reference from which I have taken is mentioned as a footnote. You can later on refer to these resources and read them. So for anybody who is genuinely interested in research, these are great resources. Okay. So the basic question that we'll be asking to decide which study design we are going to choose is, what happens to the exposure, or how are the exposures going to happen, or how are the exposures going to be assigned. Will it be under the control of investigator? When we say under control of investigator means Investigator will be deciding who will be exposed, who will not be exposed, who will be exposed to treatment A, who will be exposed to treatment B. So if it is under the control of investigator, if investigator is the one who is going to assign the exposures, if the answer to this is going to be yes, then you will need to opt for a experimental or interventional study design. If the answer to this is no, that the exposure is not going to be under control of investigator, then you will need to bother or think of appropriate observational study designs. So we'll discuss this further. So if you look into observational studies, basically observational studies can be with a comparison group or they can be without a comparison group, a single group study. Okay. So if you want, if your objective is just to define or describe what is happening, okay, what proportion of mothers are suffering from maternal depression, what proportion of my patients are going to die, what proportion of my patients smoke, what proportion of population is obese. Okay. So if your objective is just to describe, then you don't need to have a comparison group. But if your objective is to find out the risk factors, the predictors, if you understand the why or how is it happening, why hypertension is happening, what is the cause for hypertension, why some patients are dying, why some of them get active tuberculosis and some of them remain only infected for their life, they do not get the active disease. So what is happening or how is it happening? Somebody gets active disease, somebody just remains infected. So if you want to understand the why or how part of it, then there is no option but you will have to undertake an analytical study. When we say an analytical study, it has to be with a control group, a comparison group. Having a comparison group is an hallmark, is an essence of analytical study. The comparison group could be an internal comparison group. I'll give an example. Like we recruited 2,500 pregnant women, okay, and we tested each one of them for gestational diabetes. Around 780 of them were found to have gestational diabetes. Remaining were not found to have gestational diabetes. So here the comparison group is internal. It is getting derived from the same larger group of women whom we had recruited. Or it could be an external comparison group. When we say external comparison group, you will compare population A or group A or patient A with patient B. So if it's an external comparison group, you will have to describe how you will choose A group as well as how you will choose B group. But if you want to understand the why or how part of it, it's very important that you build the comparison group. Without building a comparison group, without conducting an analytical study, if you are wanting to find out the risk factors, the predictors, the causes, or the why or the how part of it, it's not going to happen. If your intention is to find out does something work, let us say if I am using N95 mask, will it help me to prevent COVID infection? So are they effective? Does it work? If I start indulging in physical activity daily, will my risk for developing hypertension go down? So will physical activity be effective in reducing hypertension or coronary artery disease? So does it work? Can it work? Okay. If you want to study this, then we'll have to opt for experimental or interventional studies. Okay. So if you want to find out the why and how, you will have to build a comparison group. Comparison group can be in observational studies or it can be in experimental studies as well. So whenever there is a comparison group, you will say that it's an analytical type of study. So the analytical studies could be both, either an observational or an experimental study. So in analytical observational study, The direction is very important, or I would rather say on what is the criteria for you to assemble or to choose or to recruit a particular group, how that group is being formed, what is the criteria for forming a group. If you are forming the group based on exposure, all those who are obese, all those who smoke, all those who drink, all those who came in close contact with a known positive COVID patient. Okay? So if you are going to constitute your groups based on exposure, so somebody would be exposed, somebody would be not exposed or non-exposed. So if you are going to constitute your groups based on exposure, and then the outcome is going to happen sometimes later. So when you are constituting your groups, the outcome has not happened. Your criteria for constituting your group is exposure. It will be a cohort type of study. So you are moving from exposure to outcome. Many times in our textbooks, they'll talk of going forward in time or going backward in time. I personally find it very confusing. Okay? So better or simpler way to remember is whether we are moving from exposure to outcome or whether we are moving from outcome to exposure, or we are not sure from where we are moving, or from we are moving from exposure to outcome or from outcome to exposure. So if we are sure that when our group is getting recruited, when the two groups are being formed, they are based on exposure and the outcome has not happened, the outcome is going to happen sometimes later, it will be a cohort study. If you are going to recruit your groups based on outcome, somebody who has suffered from stroke, somebody who has suffered from coronary artery disease, somebody who has suffered from any particular cancer, without bothering about whether they were smokers, whether they were obese, whether they were alcoholic, not alcoholic. So if you are recruiting or forming your groups purely based on outcome, so somebody who has an outcome goes in a particular group, somebody who does not have an outcome goes in the other group, and then you are going to bother about exposure. So when you are forming your groups, when the groups are getting recruited, they are recruited based on the outcome, whether outcome is present or not, and then you will find whether somebody was exposed or not. It will be a case control study. And if you are not sure whether exposure has happened, or you are recruiting your groups based on exposure or outcome, or you are assessing both the things, exposure as well as outcome simultaneously, it will be a cross-sectional study, like cutting a cake, a snapshot, taking a slice at a point of time. So it will be a cross-sectional study. If we'll again go back to the initial question, did the investigator assign exposure? If the answer to this is yes, it will be an experimental study. Then you need to ask whether there is random allocation or not. What we mean by random allocation, we cannot discuss entire randomization here, we do not have time for that, but the simplest rule of thumb that we need to follow or observe for every participant who is going to enter in your research study, if each one of them has an unknown but equal probability of entering in either of your research groups, then only we can say that it's a random allocation. If this is not being maintained for even a single patient, okay, then we cannot say that it's a random allocation. Each one of them need to have the same probability of being allocated to either of the groups, either the intervention group or to the control group, intervention A or intervention B. Okay. So if there is random allocation, then it would be a randomized study. If there is no random allocation, okay, like many times we'll see, we see that patients are divided on based on their date of birth, on the days on which they visit the OPD. Somebody visiting on Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays will go to treatment A. Somebody visiting Tuesdays Thursdays, Saturdays will go to treatment B. So none of these are random methods, because each one of them does not have the same probability of going in either of the groups. So whenever there is no random allocation, all such designs by default are known as quasi-experimental. So all non-randomized designs are known as quasi-experimental. QUASI. We'll discuss more on this. Okay. So this is a very important slide. Even if you understand this one slide, we can discuss all the study designs with the help of only this slide. This is just another way of depicting study designs. So whenever we talk of study designs, we talk in two terms: hypothesis generating and hypothesis testing. So it does not mean that from the studies with the help of which you can test a hypothesis, you cannot generate a hypothesis from them. Okay. So even a case control study or a cohort study for that matter can generate a hypothesis which can later on be tested, proven or rejected based on your RCT or experimental designs. Okay. But descriptive studies, all descriptive studies, all one group studies, single group studies would be hypothesis generating. So if you are going to study only one group, if you are very clear that you are going to conduct a descriptive study, and if somebody is asking you to write a hypothesis, you can be bold enough to say it in their face that we cannot write the hypothesis for a descriptive study a priori. Based on the findings of my descriptive study, hypothesis will be generated. So if we are writing hypothesis for a descriptive study, we are making a fool of ourselves, because descriptive studies are supposed to be hypothesis generating studies. We should not write a hypothesis for descriptive studies. So cross-sectional study is very unique. I am laying emphasis on cross-sectional study because almost 55% of you in the poll said that you have used it as a study design. So it's the most commonly used or abused study design because of its feasibility, ease of use. So cross-sectional study design is very unique. Unique in the sense it can be descriptive as well as analytical, depending on whether you conduct it with one group or you have a comparison group. Okay. But for time being, the purpose of this slide is just to highlight that descriptive studies are hypothesis generating and analytical studies are hypothesis testing. So if you want to test a hypothesis, whether A causes B, will hydroxychloroquine prevent or treat COVID-19? Okay. So if you want to test this hypothesis, you will have to use an analytical study. You will need a comparison group. You will need two groups, one who is using hydroxychloroquine and one who is not using hydroxychloroquine. If somebody is trying to prove that hydroxychloroquine can reduce COVID infection or can treat COVID with the help of only one group, you can straight away throw such a study in dustbin. Okay, because single group descriptive studies will not help you to reach an analytical inference or analytical conclusion. So as you move from your left to right, as you move from your descriptive studies towards your randomized controlled trials, the strength of evidence that you would be generating would go on increasing. We'll discuss this again. We have a last slide where we are going to talk of strength of evidence. So whatever I am going to discuss henceforth in the presentation, okay, for every study design, we'll try and understand or try and answer these 4 points. How does the basic study design look? An example of that study design. Are there any variants that we need to know about? And when is the study warranted? So like we have a concept of drug of choice. Similarly, we can propose a concept of design of choice. So for which type of research questions, what study design you need to choose. So we should be very clear. The same research question can be answered with the help of number of study designs. For example, is hydroxychloroquine effective for preventing COVID-19 infection? You can try and answer this question with the help of a cross-sectional study, a case control study, a cohort study, or a randomized control trial. Okay, given the availability of resources, the resource constraints, you should choose the design which is best suited to address this research question, not the one which is convenient. Okay, so this is very important to understand. The same research question can be answered or addressed using more than one study design. So if you have resources or within a given context, whatever is best possible, we should try and do that, not what is convenient to us. This point was also highlighted by the previous speakers as well. So for every study design, remember these are the 4 points regarding which we'll be bothering. So we'll start with the cohort study. So this is the basic design. Like I was telling you, the groups would be formed based on exposure. When we are forming the groups, we are only looking at whether somebody is exposed or somebody is not exposed. We are not going to bother about outcome. The outcome should not have happened. Okay, the outcome should not have happened when you are conducting or going to conduct a cohort study. Your groups should be formed purely and purely on the basis of your exposure. Suppose you are interested to see whether those who indulge in, let us say, practicing yoga or pranayam, is depression, anxiety, or stress less in them or not. Okay, so if you are going to conduct a cohort study for that, it should only be on the basis of those who are performing either pranayam or yoga and those who are not performing, and then later on you will try and measure the outcome. So your outcome should not bother you when you are going to form the group. The disease will develop later on. So within the exposed group, some may develop disease, some may not develop disease. Even in the not exposed group, some may develop disease, some may not develop disease. The reference quoted in the footnote here, the book by Leon Gordes, it's one of the most beautiful book for understanding research designs that you can read. A very simple, lucid language. So anybody is interested or keen to learn more about research and research designs, feel free to get a copy for yourself, either a soft copy or a hard copy. So in a cohort study, the basic design would be, we will form our groups based on the exposure, some exposed and not exposed, and then the disease may or may not develop in both the groups. I could not have chosen any other example for cohort study. Okay, it would have been very shameful for me to share an example of the cohort study that we are conducting. Okay, this is a very beautiful example of a cohort study which started way back in 1940s and which is continuing till today. So if you want to learn A to Z of cohort studies, there cannot be a better example than this. The objective of this study was to study the impact of several factors on incidence of cardiovascular diseases. The exposures were blood pressure, smoking, body weight, diabetes, whether somebody is indulging in exercise or no. Okay, and then they assessed multiple outcomes: coronary artery disease, stroke, congestive heart failure, peripheral artery disease. And this is again a very beautiful book on the Framingham Heart cohort study. Okay, so you can try and read this. It's like a novel. How research can add value to our life. We heard Dr. Abhay Bang saying how research can add value to our individual and to the population health. This book also describes the same. For cohort study, the first, the purple line is the most commonly used variant. Or if you talk to orthodox epidemiologists, orthodox researchers, they will say that this is the only pure cohort. You will start with exposure and then you will go to outcome, the concurrent cohort study design. So when you are starting now, so look at this arrow now, when you are starting at the starting point, you only have the exposure and the outcome will happen sometime later. There can be a variant which we call as the retrospective cohort. So you can go a little back in time. Let us say we are in 2020. You can go a little back in time, form your cohorts and then try and assess the outcomes today. For example, let us say there would be naturally occurring groups, subgroups. Mothers who received or who opted for taking rubella vaccine and mothers, pregnant mothers who did not opt for taking rubella vaccine. So you have two groups. So if you go back and register your cohort based on those who had received rubella vaccine and those who had not received rubella vaccine, and then see what proportion of their offsprings had congenital rubella syndrome. And if the congenital rubella syndrome is less in those, so this is an example of retrospective cohort, or it could be ambidirectional. You can combine the concurrent and the retrospective design. But what is important, irrespective of whether you are using a retrospective cohort design or a concurrent cohort design, your inquiry will always proceed from exposure to outcome. It will never proceed from outcome to exposure, or there won't be any uncertainty whether exposure has happened first or outcome has happened first. Okay? So whether it's a retrospective or a concurrent cohort, the direction of inquiry will always proceed from your exposure to outcome. It will not proceed in any other direction for a cohort study. So when is a cohort study warranted? So when you know or you suspect something to be an exposure, to be a cause, to be a risk factor, like what they did for Framingham heart study. The researchers way back in 1940s suspected that maybe smoking could lead to coronary artery disease, maybe smoking could lead to hypertension, maybe obesity could lead to hypertension, maybe obesity could lead to stroke. So they hypothesized that a particular variable could be an exposure, could be a cause factor. So there is some evidence available for that, either from an analytical cross-sectional study or from a case control study, saying that this probably is associated with this, or this probably causes this. So there is some preliminary evidence that is available to suggest an association, and you want to test that hypothesis. So that is when you will conduct a cohort study. We are not justified in conducting a cohort study if there is no evidence of such association. So you are hypothesizing it for the very first time. So we should avoid conducting a cohort study, because cohort study is very resource intensive. It will take more time, money, manpower, everything. So first we should try and see whether that hypothesis holds true in a cross-sectional or a case control study. If there is evidence through such cross-sectional, analytical cross-sectional or case control studies, then the next logical step could be a cohort or should be a cohort. Cohort should not be the very first step when there is no evidence suggestive of association that is available. If you are very sure that whatever population or groups that you are going to recruit, let us say 50%, 60%, 70% are going to run away, you are going to lose on them. So there is no fun then in conducting a cohort study. So when you can be sure that you will be able to retain the groups, you will be able to track them, you will be able to minimize the attrition, then only think of a cohort study. So the pregnancy cohort study that we are conducting becomes a very logical example, that The follow-up that we have proposed is for around 5 years, and we feel confident that we'll be able to retain at least 90% of these women from the original cohort that was registered. So as a rule of thumb, even the Indian Council of Medical Research or the Drug Controller General of India, for any of the longitudinal studies, the follow-up studies, the rule of thumb is they will question you if your loss to follow-up is going to be more than 10%. It should not be more than 10%. Yeah, if your follow-up is going to be very long, like what is happening in Framingham cohort study, it started in 1940s and there's a 60-year follow-up. So of course, then you are justified in saying that over 60 years, we'll see 30, 40, 50% follow-up. But if your follow-up is only for 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, not very long, then you should not have an attrition of more than 10%. The interval between exposure and outcome is relatively short. You cannot wait for a disease to happen for 20, 30, 40 years. It should happen within, let us say, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So it should be relatively short. If there's a very long incubation period, very long latent period, then cohort study is not warranted for testing such associations. So it should be a relatively short interval between exposure and outcome. When we talk of infectious diseases, we prefer to use the term incubation period. When we talk of chronic diseases, we prefer to use the term latent period. Whatever, whether incubation or latent period, it should be relatively shorter. The exposure should be rare. It should not be a very common exposure, and incidence of disease amongst those who are exposed should be high. Okay? So if this condition is going to be satisfied, then cohort study becomes your design of choice if the exposure is rare. For example, people who lived within, let us say, 5-kilometer radius, 10-kilometer radius, maybe 20-kilometer radius of Bhopal gas tragedy, as compared to those who lived beyond 20-kilometer radius. So is the incidence of leukemia comparable in these two groups, or is it more in those who probably would have been exposed to these radiations during the Bhopal gas tragedy? Okay. So it's a rare exposure, ionizing radiation. Okay. And we know that if somebody is exposed to ionizing radiation, the incidence of outcome is more in such people. Okay. When the exposure is harmful in nature, for example, I cannot willingly say to somebody that you go and get yourselves exposed to ionizing radiation just because I want to conduct a cohort study. It would be unethical. I cannot make people smoke for my research sake. I want to do a cohort study, smoke, and then I'll see what happens to those who smoke and what happens to those who do not smoke. No. When the exposure is harmful and we cannot conduct an interventional study, then definitely a cohort study is warranted or mandated. And of course, on a lighter note, when the investigator is sure that he or she would be alive for the duration of cohort. Okay? So if you are not going to be alive, then there is no fun in starting a cohort. Okay? So next design will come to is case control design. As we were discussing previously as well, so your starting point here should be outcome. So if you see present, what you will do now when you are going to recruit the groups. So when you are going to recruit the groups, you are only going to bother, or you should only bother about the outcome, whether the outcome is present or not. If you are going to form your groups based on outcome purely, so those who have the outcome become your cases, those who do not have the outcome become your controls. I have seen even in some of the published research papers, even those that have been published in the so-called PubMed. Okay, so everything that is published in PubMed is not gold. Okay, we have enough crap that is available to us. We have a very recent example. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, when we had a very high profile paper that was published in Lancet that had to be retracted from the NEJM. Lancet and NEJM are two of the most prestigious journals. If you ask me, it's my desire as a researcher that I should have a publication in NEJM and Lancet. But even in those papers, in those journals, papers had to be retracted. So just don't go by whether it is published in PubMed or whether it is published in Lancet or whether it is published in NEJM. We should use our discretion to find out whether there is any substance in that particular research or no. If you feel there is no substance, it's rubbish. Don't shy away from calling it crap. Whatever is garbage and should be thrown away, whether it is published in Lancet, NEJM, PubMed, or whatever journal we are talking about. So if somebody is not clear regarding what their exposure and outcome is, so an example that comes to my mind. So the researchers were saying that we conducted a case control study where we tried to assess the impact of farmer suicide in the other survivors from that same family. मतलब जिन फैमिली में फार्मर सुसाइड हुआ था उन फैमिली के बाकी लोगों का what happens to the other family members, to the psychological health of the other family members. So in this, what is exposure and what is outcome? Is farmer suicide an exposure or outcome? I'll take a quick poll. Is farmer suicide exposure or outcome? So is the question clear? So they wanted to see कि in those families where farmer suicide has happened, what is happening to the psychological health of other family members. So here farmer suicide is exposure or outcome. I'm happy almost 70% of you are saying exposure. So this is a paper published in a PubMed indexed journal where the authors claim that they have conducted a case control study. And how they have formed the groups? They have formed the groups based on whether farmer suicide has happened or not happened. So if you are going to form your groups based on your exposure, can we call it a case control study? We should not call it a case control study. So we are justified in calling a study as a case control study only when the two groups are formed based on the outcome. Is it clear what I mean? What I mean when I say that the two groups should be formed based on outcome. So if you remember, that's why I had this slide very initially in my presentation. I'll again go back to the slide and again I'll come. Exposure, outcome, and confounding variables. You need to have absolute clarity about this. Which is your exposure, which are your exposure variables, which are your outcome variables, and which are your confounding variables. If you do not understand this, you are going to make a mess of your research. You will conduct a study which you should not call a case control study, but you will end up calling it a case control study. Okay? So it's like conveying to the world that we don't understand research, we don't understand what is a case control study. Okay? So we need to be very clear regarding what are our exposure variables, what are our outcome variables, and whenever we are talking of a case control study, strictly the group should be formed. Cases and controls should be selected purely based on outcome, not on the basis of exposure. If the groups are being formed based on exposure, or if you are not sure whether the groups are formed based on our exposure or outcome, it can either be a cross-sectional or a cohort, but definitely not a case control study. Okay? So your group should be formed based on your outcome. Those who have the outcome become your cases. Those who do not have the outcome become your controls. And then you see whether the exposure was present or absent. Your direction of inquiry will move from your outcome to exposure. In a case control study, your direction of inquiry will always move from outcome to exposure. This is a very beautiful example. Okay, many times we prefer to conduct study among patients who visit our OPDs, who are admitted to the hospital in which we are working. So this beautiful diagram from Designing Clinical Research by Stephen Hulley. This very beautifully illustrates the issue with that. So if you see, the top of this nail is the total number of new cases. Many of them may not opt for receiving medical attention, or they may die before they receive any medical attention. So many of them may not receive any medical attention. Some of them may go somewhere else. They will not come to your hospital. They will not come to your clinic. Some of them may be coming to your clinic but would be misdiagnosed and sent somewhere else. They will not come to your OPD or your IPD, your wards. Some of them may die before reaching you or before a diagnosis is confirmed. And so you understand who is available to you when you finally conduct a study. You are losing on a very important chunk of patients. So what is available to you is not representative of all those who had the disease. And that is precisely the problem for all hospital-based studies. So as a rule of thumb, it's very convenient to conduct hospital-based studies, but you should be very careful when interpreting the findings of hospital-based studies. We should very carefully think about the possible biases in those studies. And if possible, whenever possible, should try and undertake a community-based study, because it would be more representative of the entire population, those who suffer from the disease or those who do not suffer from the disease. Again, this is the most beautiful example of a case control study. Very rarely you will find that based on the case control study, based on an observational study, without conducting a randomized control trial. So all those who talk of evidence-based medicine, so whenever the term evidence-based medicine comes, they will not accept anything but the findings from a randomized control trial. So they'll say if it's a case control study, if it's a cohort study, no. Tell us if it's a randomized control trial. So they are very much obsessed with randomized control trials, and there is nothing wrong with that, because randomized control trials generate very high quality evidence. They have extremely good internal validity. This is a rare example where a causation has been accepted in epidemiology, when a causation has been accepted in health without it being subjected to any randomized control trial. Smoking and lung cancer. There has never been a randomized control trial for this, and there will never be a randomized control trial for this, because we cannot subject anybody to smoking when we know that it harms. So for such harmful exposures, we'll have to resort or be content with either a case control or a cohort study. So the findings of this case control study are so strong. There is strength of association. So for all those, you should go through the Hill's criteria for causation. Will not be able to discuss. It doesn't fall under the purview of today's discussion, but you should go through the Hill's criteria, the 7 criteria that Bradford Hill, the second author here, okay, who has given for causation, and you will find that almost to the tune of 6 criteria from those 7 are met by this study, except for the temporal association, because a case control study can never prove a temporal association. Temporal association means exposure happens before outcome. So first there is cause and then effect will happen. So you are very sure that there was exposure, there was cause, and effect happened later on. So whenever you are sure about this, that when you started there was only cause or exposure that was present and effect happened later on, then only we will say that temporal association is there, or temporal association is proven. You cannot prove a temporal association from a case control study. There are only two study designs which will help you to prove a temporal association. One is a cohort and second is a randomized control trial or experimental studies. A case control study, a cross-sectional study will never help you to prove a temporal association. This is a rare example where without the temporal association being proved, we have accepted its causation. And that's why I said it would not have been fair on my part to share example of any other lesser case control study. And you will find, if you search, you will find that how they have published it, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So there are many papers. This was the very first paper that was published way back in 1915 BMJ. So go through this. Variants in a case control study, I have deliberately tried to avoid the confusing variants of prospective, retrospective case control study. No, again the purists, the orthodox epidemiologists will always say that case control study has to be retrospective, and when they say so, they are not wrong, because the direction of inquiry is always going to be from outcome to exposure. Okay, but one important variant which has added value to our evidence is something that we call as a nested case control study design. So when a case control study design is nested, it is conducted within a larger cohort study. So there is a cohort study that is already happening, ongoing, and you will nest your case control study within that. Then it becomes a nested case control design. Again, this is a very nice example, very recently published, but very beautiful. So if you see, they constituted a cohort of almost 1,78,000 individuals of type 2 diabetes, and then they followed them up to see how many of them developed dementia during follow-up. So all those who developed dementia during follow-up, they became cases for this case control study. So here the group was chosen for case control study. The group was chosen based on your outcome. Those who had the dementia become cases, those who did not have dementia became controls. So the cases and controls, both of them came from this larger cohort, this cohort of 1,78,000 odd individuals. And then the direction moved from again outcome to exposure to find out whether any of this, sex, education, age group, marital status, having cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, any of this, any of the complications of diabetes, whether that was associated with developing dementia or not. So you can read about this. I have already given the name of the study and the journal in the footnote. So this is a very nice variant, important variant of case control study, the nested case control study. So the question is when the case control study is warranted, or when it should be a design of choice. Okay, so when the disease is rare. So for all cancers which are rare, you cannot wait for eternity. Somebody may never develop the pancreatic cancer in his or her lifetime. Okay, so whenever the disease is rare, whenever the outcome is rare, because we are going to constitute the groups based on outcome. So whenever the outcome is rare, we will use a case control study. When you are not sure regarding exposure, but the outcome is happening, for example COVID. Okay, so you know that some unknown illness is happening, people are developing severe acute respiratory infection and then they are dying, so you are not sure. So you will conduct a case control study, take the isolates and try and identify the exposure. And it is usually conducted before a cohort or experimental study to generate a hypothesis. So case control study can be a hypothesis testing. I've already discussed the example of lung cancer and smoking, or it could be a hypothesis generating for the further cohort and randomized studies. Next study design comes is a randomized control trial. I think animations don't work in this. There is some issue with this. Yeah. So the yellow paper kind of a thing that you are seeing is probably the first randomized study that was conducted by James Lind, and you can read it. It's a very simple study wherein he gave oranges, lemons to 2 sailors and not to others, and what happened to the scurvy. So basically, for a randomized control trial, you need to have a reference population to whom you can extrapolate or generalize the results of your study. Your study population will come from that reference population, and then you will randomize them to 2 arms, arm 1 and arm 2. It could be treatment versus no treatment, treatment A versus treatment B, or it could be treatment versus placebo. I've already told you when we will say that it's randomized, when each of the participant who is entering that study has equal and unpredictable probability. So nobody can predict, neither the participant nor the investigator. Nobody can predict to which group they will go, whether they'll go to arm 1 or whether they'll go to arm 2. And each one of them has an equal probability of going to either of the arms. Then only we'll say that it's a randomized study. Again, the picture here, I'm not sure whether you are able to visualize, where a doctor is holding an envelope against light. You should read it. Again, it's published in Lancet. What can go wrong with randomization? It's a very nice story of how things can go wrong with randomization and how it will lead to spurious associations, or how it will lead to false inferences being drawn. And the second picture represents blinding. Okay? So if you are able to blind the respondents or the participants as well as the investigators, a double-blind randomized control trial becomes the epitome of research, or is considered to be the gold standard of research. So the evidence that a randomized control, double-blind randomized control trial will be able to generate would be a very high quality, high grade evidence, because it will help you to take care of all biases. If you have adequate sample size, your random error would be taken care of. If you are randomizing, your selection bias will be taken care of. If you are blinding, your measurement bias would be taken care of. So if you are able to take care of your randomization, will also help you to take care of your confounding biases, confounding errors. So if it's a double-blind randomized control trial, therefore we consider it to be an epitome of research, and then you will assess for outcomes in both the groups together. So this is just the flow chart. You need more rigor, particularly in regulated randomized trials, and you should report at every step the reasons why somebody was excluded, why somebody left the trial. So N needs to be reported at every step. So like Dr. Hemant was discussing with you all, so this is from the consort statement for randomized trials. You can read it later on. This is an example of which we were a part of a randomized control trial, and at the risk of sounding immodest, we feel very proud when we open the ILR, the Iceland refrigerator in which we store our vaccines for the universal immunization program, and we see the same vaccine which was once a trial vaccine now being a part of our universal immunization program. So it's a very pleasing experience for us as investigators of this particular trial. That the vaccine, the trial of which we were a part of, was not only proven to be safe and efficacious, but it is also included in our national program and is being given to the entire cohort of 27 million Indian children. So whenever we see this paper, we pat our back and say we have done a good job. The variants of randomized control trial, it could be a crossover trial. So it could be a planned crossover or an unplanned crossover. Planned crossover means a priori you will decide, like this is an example of crossover trial. So here they were trying to assess all those who are given kangaroo mother care, what happens to their pain response. So every child acted as a control for himself or herself. So they were given kangaroo mother care for some time, and then they were shifted to another group, the control group, where they did not receive kangaroo mother care. And then their pain responses were compared when they were a part of this group where they received kangaroo mother care and when they were part of the other group. There is a there's a variant known as a factorial design where you can test two treatments together, treatment A and treatment B, and then you will have 4 groups. One group which receives both, one group which receives neither, one group which receives A only, and one group which receives B only. So again, this is a very famous factorial study that has happened, the physician's health study. You can read it about on your own, but then it's a very good example of how a factorial design could be. A cluster randomized trial, the HBNC trial which Dr. Bang was discussing with you all, is the best example of cluster randomized trial that has happened in country or probably across the world. Okay, so the clusters could be schools, clinics, villages, anything that, but it will be it will not be an individual who will be randomized. So for all other previous designs, whether it's a factorial design, whether it's a crossover, or whether it's a simple parallel group trial, this is a simple parallel group trial. For all these previous study designs that we have discussed for randomized control trial, the variants and unit of randomization would be individual. But for cluster randomized trial, the entire group would be randomized. So the entire village would receive a particular intervention or they would not receive a particular intervention. The sample size calculation, everything differs for cluster randomized trial. Again, we cannot go into detail of all that. This is one of the biggest cluster randomized trial that has ever happened. So almost more than 2 lakh children were part of this particular randomized control trial. You can read about it. This has happened in our India. Okay, so you can just type for Devta trial in Google and Google should lead you there. Okay, so this is again, so apart from HBNC, this is another very good cluster randomized trial that has happened in our country. Again, this was published in Lancet. And all other designs, pre-post design without a control group. So many times we are fond of this design. So we'll do a baseline, we'll do some intervention, and then we'll do post-intervention measurements. Pre-post design with control group. You are not randomizing, you are taking 2 groups and doing a pre-post design. Non-randomized studies, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, odd number birth date, even number birth date, going to unit A, going to unit B. Okay, so all these are non-randomized designs and will fall under the heading of quasi-experimental. I could have shared any other example, but I'm deliberately sharing this example because this was done by our own students at MGIMS. And this was also published. So it's not that students can only undertake, undergraduate students can only undertake cross-sectional studies. They can also undertake good quasi-experimental studies as well. We have something known as White Coat Army at our institute, wherein group of students come together and try to do health promotion among patients who visit the hospital. So the White Coat Army did not restrict itself just to the hospital, but then it worked in the school as well as communities. And this is from a school where whatever health promotion for reducing tobacco use that the students had prepared, the participatory health promotion initiative, how that impacted on tobacco use. So when we are warranted for conducting any interventional study, okay, whether it's randomized, whether it's non-randomized, whether it is cluster, whatever, so we should have something that is known as clinical equipoise. The best example that I can give in today's time is of hydroxychloroquine. So there is clinical equipoise for this. There is a difference of opinion amongst experts. So all of them do not belong to the same group. Many of them feel it works, many of them feel it doesn't work. The opinion is divided. So whenever there is a divided opinion, whenever we are not sure whether something works or something doesn't work, we will say that clinical equipoise is there. It's not unequivocal. Okay? So if you say that whether rotavirus vaccines help to reduce rotavirus diarrhea and deaths because of diarrhea. So it's not unequivocal now because the evidence has already proven it. So this is what we mean by clinical equipoise. There has to be a divided opinion amongst the experts. Whenever we want to assess effect of intervention, whenever we want to compare two treatments, whenever the intervention is harmful and you cannot use it, for example, smoking, I have already given this example. When there are no ethical concerns, when it is relevant and important, so that is when a experimental design or an interventional design or a randomized controlled trial is warranted. And that is why you will find many experts, they are again and again recommending that it's high time that we conduct a high quality randomized controlled trial for hydroxychloroquine, because we have enough evidence that has come up from case control studies, from cohort studies, but we want grade A evidence, and therefore they are recommending or they are advocating for randomized controlled trials. Cross-sectional designs, the most commonly used. This is how the design looks like. So there would be a defined population. We are not talking about cases or controls or exposed or not exposed. Okay, we'll gather the data on both exposure as well as disease at one point of time. So you will have four groups: those exposed and having disease, those exposed but not having disease, those not exposed but having disease, and those not exposed and not having disease. So all this happens simultaneously. There is no direction of inquiry. Like for case control, we said that the direction of inquiry moves from outcome to exposure. For cohort, we said that it moves from exposure to outcome. There is no direction of inquiry here because we are not sure that when we have, or rather both have happened when we collect our data. The outcome has also already happened and the exposure is also already there, and we are collecting data on both exposure and outcome simultaneously at one point of time. So again, I could have cited any other examples for cross-sectional studies, but deliberately, because I was informed that almost around 80 to 90% of the participants today are undergraduate students, and this is just to make you believe that any undergraduate student can undertake a decent quality research and get it published, provided you have the passion and willingness for this. All these 5 papers that you are seeing on screen are done by our undergraduate students. You'll find their names as the first authors. So none of them has been done as part of any of the larger funded projects or have been done by faculty. No, these were all planned, designed, conceived, implemented, conducted, published by the undergraduate students themselves. So if our students can do it, anybody can do it. Cross-sectional study, I've already told you, this can be descriptive or it could be analytical. For an analytical cross-sectional study, we will need a control group. Okay. Cross-sectional study could be a single point of time, or you can keep on conducting multiple cross-sections, like all our national surveys. For example, the census that happens, for example, the National Family Health Survey that happens. So in that given population, you can keep on doing multiple cross sections, 1 saal baad, 3 saal baad, 5 saal baad. But we cannot call it as a cohort study. A period cross sectional study, a period prevalence study cannot be considered as a cohort study, because we are not sure whether the same individual will be included in the next cross section or not. So you cannot trace it back to the same individual, and therefore these are multiple cross sections that are happening in a given period, and we'll call it as period prevalence, but we should refrain from calling it as a cross sectional study, or as a cohort study. So when is a cross sectional study warranted? So when you want to assess the magnitude either of exposure or of outcomes. For why I'm saying exposure, because particularly for non-communicable diseases, the disease may not be present today, particularly in adolescents, youth. If they are using tobacco, if they are using alcohol, if they are living a sedentary life, they may not have hypertension, coronary artery disease today, but they may develop it 10, 20 years down the line. So it's not just about prevalence of outcome. We can even have prevalence of exposures, the risk factors, through cross-sectional studies. When you want to generate hypothesis and when you want to evaluate national health programs, if your objective is program evaluations, cross-sectional studies come very handy. The other descriptive studies, the single group studies, could be an ecological study. Again, the example that comes to my mind is something, as a researcher, I'm not very sure whether I should laugh on that or not. The BCG vaccine and prevention of COVID, if you have heard about it. Okay, so they are hypothesizing that all those who have received BCG vaccine, so maybe today if I am around 40 years of age, I may have received BCG vaccine some 40 years back, and that is going to protect me today after 40 years from having COVID infection. This is very absurd. Okay, so in ecological studies, what will happen is we'll study at aggregate levels, will not study them at individual levels, and this is precisely the ecological fallacy. Whatever finding you will get at the macro level will not hold true at individual level. It cannot be extrapolated to the individuals within that particular group. Maybe BCG is not in the routine immunization of any of the Western countries. It's not their fault. Maybe they have not had an active case of tuberculosis in last 3 or 4 decades. So why should BCG be a part of their immunization program? Tuberculosis is active in our country. We are getting active cases of tuberculosis. Therefore, BCG is a part of our immunization program. Therefore, naturally, you will find that if our population or if population from low and middle income countries has received BCG vaccine and it took some time for the COVID to reach from the developed nations to the low and middle income countries. And if you have assessed at that point of time when it had still not reached the low and middle income countries like India or for that matter any other countries, and if you are saying that BCG vaccination is preventing against COVID, it's a very best example of ecological fallacy or what could go wrong specifically with ecological studies. Case studies when you have a single patient. So like the previous speaker who was speaking in just before me, like the example that he was citing, a odd deviation of some radial artery, and you publish that. So that becomes a case study. Case series when you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 such patients. So more than one number of cases that you are publishing one after the another, or you are publishing the findings together. Discovery of HIV/AIDS is a very beautiful example of case series. It was initially called as Slim's disease, if you all remember. Slim's disease because those 5, 6 initial patients who presented with that disease were very cachectic. So that's how case series can help, but then they add very little value to our evidence. So if you have to choose a study design, which design you should choose, and it will depend on your research question. If your objective is to prove causation, if your objective is to prove etiology, cohort, case control, depending on what is feasible to you, becomes your choice. If cohort is feasible and still you are opting for case control, then it's a crime. So the first mentioned design should be the design of choice. If it is feasible, possible, if resources are there, we should go for the best possible design. If you want to prove something works or not, therapy, if the question is related to therapeutics, there is no choice but to use a interventional study or a RCT. If you want to predict prognosis, कि जिनको ये treatment मिला है उनमें से कितने जिंदा रहते हैं, कैसे prognosis है, cohort becomes your design of choice. For harmful exposures, we cannot conduct a RCT. So we need to resort back to either a case control or a cohort. For diagnostic studies, whether a particular investigation, what is its sensitivity, how accurate is it helpful, not helpful, a cross-sectional, a case control design is more commonly used. If the investigation is going to change the course of outcome, is going to change the course of disease, then only it would be an interventional study. Otherwise, it would be an observational study which would get classified as a cross-sectional or a case control. So for only those investigations which are a part of interventional radiology, wherein or such similar investigations where along with the investigations, whatever intervention that you are going to do is going to change the course of disease, is going to change the outcome directly, then only it would be an experimental design. Otherwise, by default, all diagnostic studies fall under observational design and could be either cross-sectional or case control. If your objective is to find out magnitude, depending on whether you want to find out prevalence or whether you want to find out incidence. If it's prevalence, cross-sectional study. If it's incidence, either a cohort or a RCT. And if your objective is to find out the cost effectiveness, how effective, cost effective something is, how efficient something is, then we need to undertake economic evaluations. This is a very nice resource, teachepi.org, okay, maintained by Dr. Madhukar Pai. For all those who want to learn more about research designs, epidemiology, research in general, feel free. All his presentations, all his resources are available free. So this is what we mean by hierarchy of evidence. Notable here is the last row, the bottom of pyramid. Case reports, opinion papers. I might be an expert, but my individual opinion would not be ranked very high in the hierarchy of scientific evidence. And just look at the gray circle. Okay, so your WhatsApp, YouTube's, Twitter's, Facebook's is not counted as scientific evidence. Dr. Hemant was again talking to you regarding meta-analysis and systematic reviews. It's kind of secondary data analysis, but they are the ones which will give you the strongest evidence. So when we talk of in terms of evidence, we talk of grade A, grade B and grade C. So at least one properly conducted large randomized controlled trial, double blind randomized controlled trial. If that is there, or if a systematic review or meta-analysis is there, then we'll say that it has grade A evidence. For all others, for quasi-experimental designs, well-conducted control study without randomization. So for non-randomized interventional studies, for your case controls, for your cohorts, for your exceptionally conducted cross-sectional studies, the evidence would either be grade B or grade C. And individual authorities are professors, are HOUs, are HODs, are deans. Anybody can say anything, but individual opinions, we should know where they rank in the hierarchy of evidence. Not to disrespect any individual, but then we should know that when we are talking of hierarchy of evidence, where do these individual opinions fall? So this is my last slide for the first part of the talk that I'm giving, supposed to give regarding the study design options. Before we move to the next part, I'll prefer to take questions here if that is fine with the moderators. I'll end with this quote by our founder director, Dr. Sushila Nair, who was also a personal physician to Gandhiji, and an attempt is a small thing. So the research that you are planning to do might be very small, but it can hold the promise for the future. Had Dr. Abhay Bang thought कि ये बहुत छोटी सी चीज़ है, community health worker को train करके क्या होगा, so home-based newborn care would never have been a reality. Okay? So don't demean yourselves. Okay? Whatever you are planning, howsoever small it might be, do it diligently with enough rigor, with enough commitment and passion, and it may hold a promise for the future. Thank you.
So thank you, sir. That was the end of sir's first part. We would move on to the question and answers. So we have some questions here. So the first question is, sir, can you explain attrition with an example? Sir?
Sir, you may continue your presentation for the data collection tools, and we'll take the questions together at the end of the session. The next presentation, Prabhat, can you please
Yes,
upload
yes,
the
yes, sure. I will
presentation?
just start with the second question. We had gone on to the first question and answer, but it's alright. Let's move to the question, next question first. So, moving to data collection.
Sir will be uploading the presentation.
I have,
अपलोड होगा
I think I have it. Data collection techniques. I have the presentation here uploaded. Should I start with it?
दिख रहा है क्या
Yes, sir. It's visible.
You can go ahead, sir. We'll take the questions at the end of this.
can you see the presentation
We
Yes,
can.
sir. Yes, sir. We can.
so we in this part we'll talk of data collection techniques and here we are talking about this section from our anatomy of research. So I've deliberately used the same slides just to maintain that continuity of thought. So when we are talking about data collection, it's the variables section, what measurements that we'll be making, that is what we are bothered about. So I've discussed this slide. Again, I am reiterating, we should have absolute clarity regarding our exposure, outcome, and confounding variables. I'll explain this with example again. So many of you may be aware, this is from the Alice in Wonderland, where Alice is asking to the cat, would you tell me please which way I need to go? And the cat says it depends on good deal where you want to go. And then Alice says I don't much care where. And then the cat says then it doesn't matter which way you go. So if you are not very sure what you want to achieve from your research, then it will not lead you anywhere, or you should refrain from conducting such research. So we should be very clear regarding the objective of our research, why we are wanting to conduct that particular research. So whatever we are going to discuss will be applicable across all study designs, whether it's observational, whether it is experimental, whether it is analytical. So the acronyms that you are seeing here in red bricks kind of a thing, PO, PECO, and PICO are related to the research questions. I'm not sure whether this was discussed by the previous speakers. So whatever our data collection, it should not be de-linked from our objectives or from our research question. It's very important that we think it of as a continuum. It should be in continuation or in sync with our research question. So usually we prefer to use this acronym PICOTS, PICOTS. So if it's an interventional study, it will be a PICOTS. If it's a observational study, it would be a PECOTS. If it's a descriptive study, it will be a POTS, like you see here. So if for a descriptive study, it's PO, for analytical study, it is PECO, and for interventional study, it would be PICO. So P is basically we should describe what is our patient or what is the problem that we are trying to address through our research. I is intervention for observational studies, E is exposure, C is our comparison or control group, O is the outcome or endpoint, T is the time frame, and S is settings. So whenever you are going to start on any research, I'll say that this should be the first step. You should write your research question in the form of either PICOTS or PECOTS or POTS. The reason is if you are able to identify this, delineate this at the very beginning, you won't make a mistake like what we were discussing for the farmer's suicide and its effect on the family survivors that we were discussing. So if you put your research question in this framework of PICOTS, you will already have your exposure and your outcome variables. So you'll already have your exposure and your outcome variables. Then you need to bother only about capturing or defining your confounding variables and how you are going to measure them. So that is the advantage of having a research question. It will help you to define your variables, your exposure variables, your outcome variables. So this is an example of research question. This is again from the rotavirus trial that we conducted. So the research question here was, does a 3-dose series of bovine reassortant pentavalent vaccine administered orally 1 month apart and beginning at 6 weeks help to prevent severe rotavirus gastroenteritis through adequate IgA in healthy Indian infants when concurrently administered with standard UIP vaccines as compared to a placebo? If you see in this research question, you'll find that all those elements are there. In the interest of time, I won't ask you to identify those elements, but then if you see, all those elements are there. So it talks of the P is population, the Indian infants. It talks of the intervention, the new vaccine, the trial vaccine, the bovine reassortant pentavalent rotavirus vaccine. The comparison here was the placebo. The outcome was severe rotavirus gastroenteritis. This was not the only outcome. There were almost 2 primary outcomes and 17 secondary outcomes. But then your research question should mention at least the primary outcome. So this was one of the primary outcomes, whether the child suffered from severe rotavirus gastroenteritis in the next 1 year at least in Indian infants. When we are saying infancy is almost, we all know it's when the child becomes 1 year of age. The 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 14 weeks में यदि वैक्सीन लग रही है तो अगले 1 साल में 1 year तक can it prevent severe rotavirus gastroenteritis? And the settings was in India. This trial was conducted within India. So if you have such a research question which is ready with you in such a PICOTS format, so when we are planning data collection, what we had to measure? So we had to measure the exposure variable. किसको वैक्सीन मिला, किसको प्लेसिबो मिला, that we had to measure. We had to measure the outcome कि rotavirus gastroenteritis हुआ के नहीं हुआ. And then we had to think of confounding variables कि मेल चाइल्ड में, मेल इन्फेंट्स में ज्यादा होगा कि फीमेल इन्फेंट्स में ज्यादा होगा. सो वी कैप्चर्ड सेक्स. जो पढ़े लिखे पेरेंट्स है उनमें ज्यादा होगा कि जो इलिटरेट पेरेंट्स है उनमें ज्यादा होगा. सो वी कैप्चर्ड एजुकेशन ऑफ पेरेंट्स. We captured socio-economic status. So whatever we feel could be the confounding variables which could deviate our results, we need to think of all those confounding variables and capture those. As a rule of thumb, if you do not understand much about confounding variables, the minimum confounders that we need to adjust for are age, sex, socio-economic status, education. Okay, at least if you have to adjust, then it should be minimum for age and sex. So when you are writing your objectives, your research question should get translated into your objectives. Your primary objective should be in sync with your research question. So if your research question is something, whatever your research question is stating, your primary objective should also state that. There could be secondary objectives as well. Whatever are your primary and secondary objectives, the same should be in alignment, in sync. So your primary outcomes and secondary outcomes should also be the same. There should not be any disalignment. There should not be any discrepancy. कि research question कुछ अलग बोल रहा है, objectives कुछ अलग बोल रहा है, and outcomes are saying something different. All these three should be in alignment, in sync with each other. And if your objectives and outcomes are within sync with each other, then based on your research question, you will be able to identify at least the exposure and the outcome variables, the intervention and the outcome variables, and think of the confounders. And as I've told you, minimum that we need to think of age, sex, education, socioeconomic status, depending on the type of study. So we should define our variables, whatever. So we should identify them. These are my exposure. So in good protocols, you will find that under measurement section, under data collection section, they'll say that we'll measure these variables. These are our exposure variables, these are our outcome variables, and these are the possible confounding variables which we'll try and capture. It's very important that we define our variables. Again, an example from a study published by our own student. Okay? So if you see the title here says maternal depression and its association with responsive feeding and nutritional status of infants, a cross-sectional study from a rural medical college in central India. So if you see here, maternal depression was the exposure, whether a mother is depressed or not depressed. And depending on whether a mother is depressed or not depressed, is she able to practice responsive feeding or not, or how is the nutritional status of her child, whether the child is having underweight, wasting or stunting. So the outcome variables for responsive feeding and nutritional status of the child. So if you can read this paper, it's available. Okay, so this is what I have copy pasted from the published paper. So here she is defining her exposure variable. For this study, she has used the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale, and she is saying for this study a cutoff score of more than 10 was used to diagnose maternal depression. So when you will call it as maternal depression. So this is what I mean by defining the variable. So here she has defined the exposure variable. Here she has defined one of the outcome variables, and if you see those numbers in parentheses, brackets, they are the references from her paper. So if anybody goes and see 11 number reference, they'll be able to go to that link which describes about the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale and the various cutoffs and how a cutoff of more than 10 for diagnosing depression is valid. Okay. For the outcome variable, she says standard definitions of underweight, stunting and wasting were considered as defined in the WHO child growth charts. These are standard definitions. You can just give the reference saying we are using the definitions from this particular reference. So this was for the nutritional status. For responsive feeding, this is what she writes. For responsive feeding assessment, what tool she has used, what are the questions in that, and a mother scoring 3 or more was considered to be indulging in responsive feeding. And again, she has given the reference here. The number 13 reference will inform to the reviewers, to the readers, that this particular tool that she is using is valid for capturing responsive feeding. So this is what we mean, what I said in the previous slide, that we should identify and define our variables. This should be done right at the protocol stage and not at the stage of when you are writing your paper, when you are done with when you are done with your study. No, all this should be thought at the time of writing your protocol and should be put in black and white in your protocol. So if before you conduct your data collection, we need to finalize our tool. We need to ensure that our tool has all the variables. Our tool will help us to capture the exposure, the outcome and the confounding variables. So whatever we intend to analyze, whatever is our objective, our tool should ensure that it is going to help us capture all that. Otherwise, it's a crime to use such a tool. It will not help you to achieve your research objectives. It's a very good practice to prepare something that we call as a code book. I'll show you some examples. For the in the interest of time, we won't be able to discuss how to prepare a code book, but I'll show you examples, and it's not a rocket science. It's very simple and logical. So code book is also called as data dictionary. Okay? So this is how a code book should look like. So there would be a variable name, a variable label. So let us say name underscore parent. So this is how it will look like in the software when we analyze the data. The variable label is the explanation of that full name of parent. Variable type, whether it's a numerical, whether it's a string variable. String variables are the ones which we are not supposed to analyze. You will not be able to take any numeric function on them. You will not be able to calculate the mean, the median. So you won't be able to operate any numeric functions on those string variables. So you should define a priori before you start collecting data, that what are the variables that you want to collect, how those variables are going to be. So you need to give a thought कि आप उसको कैसे analyze करने वाले हो. So if you are wanting to apply a mathematical function to a given variable, then there is no way you can capture that as a string variable. You can even think of permissible values, like for gender, if you see, we have defined the values 1 male and 2 female for whether the child has received BCG vaccination, whether the child has received OPV vaccination. If yes, 1, if no, 2. So whatever values we need to define those. If there is a special format, like weight we wanted to capture in kilograms, the birth weight, the present weight, because we were going to measure it ourselves, birth weight was going to come from records. We were not very sure कि कहाँ पे कैसे record होगा. So we thought that if a electronic weighing scale is not available everywhere, a 4-digit birth weight in grams may not be possible. Therefore, we decided to capture it in kilograms. But the present weight which we ourselves were going to capture, we have captured it in grams. If you are going to capture dates, we need to specify how the format for date should be. Otherwise, you won't be able to apply formulae. So if you are capturing date of birth and if you are capturing date of interview, there is no reason why you should ask for age. You should be able to derive it on its own. So date of interview minus date of birth should give you age for that particular respondent. But that is only possible when you capture date in both the dates in the same format. If you do some mistake there, then you won't be able to capture, you won't be able to apply the formula in the software. And then there should be a variable description. So these are the standard columns for any code book or data dictionary. So it's a very best practice. If you are able to prepare your data dictionary, if you are able to prepare your code book before you begin your data collection, be rest assured you will not do many things wrong as a part of your data collection. This is another example of code book. So there were more than almost 200 variables. I cannot show you everything here. This is just to give you example that we even need to think of different ways, different types. So in some places it would be a date variable, in some places it would be a numerical variable, the start date. So depending on how you plan to analyze that variable, you need to capture it accordingly. So once your tool is ready, once your code book for that is ready, then you should proceed for data collection. Choice is yours, whether you want to do a paper based collection or a paperless collection. Whether you do a paper based or paperless, okay, it doesn't matter as long as you are going to maintain rigor. If you are not going to maintain rigor, whether you do paper based or paperless, it's going to produce crap data. It's not going to produce valid results. Even if it is paperless, it should be in sync of your paper copy. It should not be very different from your paper copy. So as a best practice, what we have been following for all those projects in which we are indulging in paperless data collection, first our questionnaire, our tool is ready in a paper form. Once that is ready, once the code book is ready, then only we proceed to create that questionnaire in a software for our paperless data collection. It should not be vice versa कि आपने कुछ सॉफ्टवेयर में कर लिया एंड देन यू आर स्ट्रगलिंग कि अरे इसमें एक्सपोजर आया कि नहीं आया, आउटकम आया कि नहीं आया, you haven't defined those things. So it should not be vice versa. Even if you are doing paperless, your paper copy, your final tool should be ready a priori and then proceed for making it as a soft copy in your software. Irrespective of whether it is paper based or paperless, you should pre-test it at least on 5 subjects, 10 subjects before actually using it in your project. Again, this is a best practice. If it's a paperless, there are many tools that you can use. The one that we are currently using is the Kobo toolbox. In past, we have used EPI Info, we have used EPI Surveyor. Like my previous speaker was talking about, you can even use simple Google Forms, you can use SurveyMonkey. The list is, this is not an exhaustive list. The list is endless. These are some of the ones that are commonly used. It's up to you what you want to use. But what is most important is not the software. What is most important is your brainware. If you have a logical thinking, if you are going to use your brainware, then you will not make mistakes. Whether you are using a paper-based, you are doing paper-based collection, or you are doing a paperless collection. If you are not going to apply your mind, then you are going to make mistakes at both the places. Some of the golden rules that we have learned over our experience over last few years, pulse of wisdom you can say. Whenever available, use a standard questionnaire. So whatever is your objective, try to find out whether there is a standard questionnaire that is available. Like The example I discussed with you, she used the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale. हम हमारे मन से भी we could have created 10, 15, 20 questions, but then that would not have been a valid questionnaire. So if there is a valid tool, a valid questionnaire that is already available, we should use that. Even if the tool is valid, whether that is valid in our context. So if the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale was never used or validated in India, we using it would not have been justified. Because it has already been used and validated in India, that is something which justifies the use in the project. So look for a standard questionnaire, look for a valid tool, a tool which is validated in our context. You can even take some questions from the standard questionnaire, like NFHS questionnaire, the National Family Health Survey questionnaire. So if you want to ask regarding age, sex, occupation, income, okay, so you should not frame those questions as per your convenience. Okay, already standard questions are available, so why not take those standard questions or questions from those standard questionnaires? Whenever possible, collect data in coded form. So jitna bhi, because most of the softwares for data analysis will understand only the numeric language. They won't understand MALE or FEMALE. They will only understand 1, 2, 0. So whenever possible, code your data and collect it in numeric form. Sare data ko code karo. And that is the reason, or that is the importance of preparing your code book. Otherwise, people will go and enter 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and then they don't remember what is 1 and what is 2 and what is 3. And then they guess later on ki shayad ye 3 hoga, shayad wo 1 hoga. And then it creates lots of errors and confusion. So that is the importance of creating a code book and defining everything a priori, your codes. Whenever possible, collect every variable as a continuous data. For example, age. Okay, you can ask my actual age and record it as, let us say, 40, or you can classify me as between 25 to 45 years of age. So whenever possible, record it as a continuous data. You can always recode it. You can always form those groups, 15 to 45, 25 to 45, less than 40, more than 40, under 5, 5 to 15. If you have the absolute age, you can always recode it, but you cannot do it vice versa. So if you have only asked, and if you have only entered it as, let us say, 2, if I am belonging to a 25 to 45 year age group, and you have just entered 2 in your data collection form, you will not be able to calculate the mean age of your participants, the median age of your participants, the mean income. So that is not desirable. So whenever possible, try to collect data for every variable as a continuous data. You can always convert it into a categorical data depending on how you want to recode it, but you cannot make it vice versa. And last but very important, do not collect anything that is not your objective or you don't plan to analyze. कर लेंगे, देखेंगे, बाद में कुछ analysis करेंगे. Okay, so that's not desirable. That is not at all desirable. So whatever you want to analyze, that should be decided, and your only those variables should be captured which you plan to use and analyze in your final statistical analysis or data analysis. This is just some examples of paper based. So again, like if you see, we have used the standard NFHS questions here to ask regarding caste or highest level of education or for date of birth or even for that matter sex. For physical activity also, we have used the standard WHO STEPS questionnaire. So the codes would be available there. The question may look very long, but the advantage of entering that, person will only have to write 1 or 2. It saves a lot of time while data collection. Even if it's a paperless form, they'll just have to enter 1 or 2, or they will have to choose it from 1 or 2. So it's always desirable that we code and our options are ready. This is from the Kobo toolbox, which our current students are using. Again, I do not have any hesitation in declaring that whatever Kobo forms that I am displaying here on my screen are from our undergraduate students project. So this is by Isha, as you can see her name there on the top. This is part of the STS project that she is doing. So she is even taking consent through this platform, and she has an approval for that from the ethics committee, saying because my research involves just slightly more than minimal risk, the verbal consent should suffice. This is from another student's project where she undertook a case control study to find out the association between psychosocial stress and hypertension. So there are sections. There is a section on socio-demographic assessment. There is a section on assessment for psychosocial stress. There is a section on assessment for risk factors for hypertension. Quality of life was her one of the objectives. So there is a section on quality of life where she is using the WHO quality of life scale. So this is in short regarding data collection. Again, the same quote here. So we can open it for any questions, discussion. If you have any queries, that's it from my side.
Thank you, sir, for making such a complex topic simpler for us to understand. I'm totally aware that covering all of its study designs and data collection tools is a very difficult task due to the time constraints. But you were able to cover the topic, and I'm sure that after hearing you, our delegates will be better able to select their design of choice for answering the research question. Thank you, sir. Over to Prabhat for question and answers and concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, sir. So, moving on to the questions that we received during the session. So, moving to the first question, sir, can you explain attrition with an example?
Prabhat,
Hello. Yeah, I'm here. Hello. Hello. Am I audible? Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Fair. Fair. So, sir, should I repeat the question?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Okay. So, sir, the first question was, can you explain attrition with an example?
Okay, like in the present pregnancy cohort study that we are conducting, we had recruited 2,500 pregnant women. 38 of them, they have migrated to other districts. So we are not able to contact them or do a follow-up with them. Like for follow-up, we have one of the outcome variables was what impact it has on the development of their child. So we had to measure child development scores for those women, for children of those particular pregnant women, and the nutritional status of those children. So we are not able to make those measurements. So this is what we mean by attrition, loss to follow-up. They won't be available to you for measuring your outcomes.
Okay, so thank you, sir. Moving on to the next question. So another question that we had is, aren't cohort studies unethical in some cases? How can we let one group continue with the exposure knowing that there is a high chance of it causing damage?
Yeah, so this is a very relevant question. So for some of the exposures like cohort, for like smoking, even you cannot do a cohort study in today's times, especially knowing that smoking is harmful. So the ethics committee who is going to review your proposal, they'll say that you need to tell them that this is harmful. So for many of these harmful exposures where it is proven beyond doubt that these are harmful, we cannot even do a cohort study. We'll have to resort to case control or a cross-sectional design. Very true. I mean, it's a very nice question.
Okay, okay, sir. So moving on to the last question, sir. What is the difference between retrospective cohort study and a case control study? This is something related to the theory, but then it was in
Yeah.
the-
See, what is important to understand is whether, although we are calling it as retrospective, when we are assembling our cohorts, the outcome has not happened. The outcome happens sometime later. So the direction of inquiry remains same from exposure to outcome. But for a case control study, it's always the groups would be formed based on outcomes. So that is between whether it's a retrospective cohort or a concurrent cohort and a case control design, the basis on which your groups are formed. Okay? Whether it's a retrospective cohort or a concurrent cohort, your groups will always be formed based on your exposure and never on based on your outcomes.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. This was all with the question and answers. Over to Dr. Sheth, sir. Hello. Hello.
Prabhat, are there any other questions?
No, we are done with the questions.
We are done. Okay. So over to you, Garima, for concluding statements.
Garima, you are on mute.
Sorry, Prabhat, can you continue for the
Yeah, sure.
concluding session?
Yes,
And
sure.
just for the participants, we have uploaded the link for the questionnaire over there. You can just click on it and you can fill it out after the end of the session. Prabhat, you can continue.
Okay, so thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. It was a great day. Like, we had a long run for a lot of sessions all at once today, and thank you so much for being such a great audience. Thank you so much for all your questions. Thank you so much for engaging with us. We'll be back with another set of speakers and another set of sessions tomorrow at same time at 2 o'clock, and we'll be talking other domains of research as well tomorrow. So thank you so much. With this, I would like to conclude today's session. Hoping to see you all soon tomorrow.
Also, sir, today's session, like the last session, it was like we already had like where it is a quite misconception, or like in general everyone used to say that community medicine is a very boring subject, but still we have got many replies from the students. We have got their feedback during the session on the WhatsApp, and like that is really amazing session, and students have started loving medicine. They want to started loving community medicine, and they want to further continue and do further researches. And that was a really amazing session. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, Shiv, sir, for helping us and for being with us. Always being so supportive. And thank you, Amul.
Of course. Thank you, Garima. I think that would mark the end of the session. We can close it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Guys, you can just fill out the questionnaire and stay tuned. Tomorrow again, we will be having the session from 2 o'clock. So please be on time to avoid any delays. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
And also thank you, Prabhat, the co-moderator.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garima. Thank you, Abhishek, sir.
Thank you, sir. So we'll just